handshake in a ruined railway station. Staffs traded, maps unfolded, and two dictators, each convinced that history has given them a single moment to secure survival and glory, decide to convert rivalry into partnership. Picture Hitler and Stalin, not merely signing a non-aggression treaty, but negotiating satrapies, quotas, and joint commands. Picture Tokyo's emissaries counting on the pact to free Japanese forces in Manchuria and Korea to move south without Soviet interference. That single pivot, an axis that includes the Soviet Union, sounds improbable because it violates the ideological grammar of the 1930s and 1940s, but counterfactuals ask us to test probability against incentive. To make such a scenario remotely plausible, we must change a handful of concrete facts of late interwar Eurasia: leadership psychology, intelligence calculus, and the sequencing of crises. Stalin's paranoia, his obsession with security along two long frontiers, and the bitter memory of the First World War pushed Soviet strategy toward defensive depth and preemptive suspicion. Hitler's racial doctrine and imperial kitchen table plans for Lebensraum in the East made him uniquely an antagonist. However, both men were also practical realists when threatened. Both prized territory, resources, and strategic depth above purity when survival was at stake. For the USSR to join the Axis, three structural shifts would be necessary. First, a believable opening that convinces Stalin that alliance generates more advantage than risk. Perhaps a prolonged Western diplomatic paralysis in 1939 to 1940, a crushing British naval collapse that removes any credible counterweight in Europe, and a U.S. decision to remain strictly neutral in 1940 so that Britain looks dangerously alone. Second, a change in the domestic Soviet calculus. Either an internal political change that elevates technocratic pragmatists above ideological commissars, or a critical intelligence failure, showing an imminent British collapse and a real fear that Germany could dominate the continent and then threaten the Soviet state. Third, a reliable Japanese commitment, explicit or tacit, to deny aggression in the Far East in exchange for Soviet cooperation or non-interference. A Tokyo that prioritizes a southern expansion and raw materials over Siberian gains, and so finds it useful to embed the USSR within an anti-Anglo-American bloc. None of these are impossible in counterfactual history. A faltering Royal Navy in 1940, a larger fall of France, with a German Navy triangle pressing the Atlantic, and greater Axis success against North Africa could be spun into a narrative where Soviet leaders perceive a moment to convert temporary alignment into long-term advantage. If these conditions were met and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact hardened into a military alliance by mid-1941, the map of the Second World War, its logistics, strategic priorities, and moral architecture would change rapidly and profoundly. Start with the simplest material fact. The Eastern Front in the real war consumed central resources, men, material, fuel, and rail capacity of Nazi Germany, and at the same time it cost the USSR its western industrial regions, cities, and tens of millions of lives. If the Red Army instead stood as an ally, Germany's strategic headache, its vast and untenable 1,500-mile eastern frontier, shrinks into a managed partnership. Imagine German planners freed from the expectation of absorbing and pacifying vast Slav territories by occupation, and instead able to coordinate production and manpower with Soviet industry. The immediate military dividend on the European theater would therefore be stupendous in relative terms. Units that in our history bled on the Eastern Front would be available to press the British Isles, to sustain U-boat campaigns longer, and to challenge the United States across the Atlantic. Likewise, Soviet formations, vast, experienced, and, after 1942, increasingly professional, could be redeployed to secure resource lines in Central Asia, to garrison the Caucasus jointly with German access to oil fields, or to commit expeditionary forces into Asia to improve Japanese campaigns. The point is not that the Axis would suddenly enjoy invincibility. It is that the balance of forces would tilt sharply against the Anglo-American coalition, and the effects ripple from logistics to psychology. Consider industrial output. The Soviet economy before 1941 was a massive, if often inefficient, producer of steel, machine tools, and raw materials. German industry had high technical quality and control of Central Europe's manufacturing base. Japan commanded resources across East Asia and the Pacific. Put together in a coordinated war economy, an axis with Soviet railways, German engineering, and Japanese access to markets and raw materials. The combined productive base would be deeper and more geographically diversified than in the historical axis. That said, cooperation would face real friction. Rail gauges, command languages, fiscal systems, and fundamentally different industrial cultures complicate rapid integration. In practice, wartime coordination would require multinational staffs, unified logistics corridors, a standard gauge agreement, protected supply lanes, and the surrender, at least temporarily, of sovereignty in some economic matters. Could these be negotiated? If the leading states feared an Anglo-American naval-industrial juggernaut more than they feared each other, the answer is yes. A joint axis could, for instance, agree on carve-ups. Germany takes Western and Central Europe and access to raw materials. The USSR secures the Baltic and much of Eastern Europe as a buffer and obtains German-provided technology and southern ports in exchange for grain and manpower. Japan accepts dominion over East and Southeast Asia, while receiving assurances against Soviet interference in Manchuria and Sakhalin. These territorial bargains, backed by explicit military guarantees and monitored by shared commissions, would be the currency of trust. Now translate this into operational consequences by focusing on a single decisive factor in the real war: manpower deployment. Historically, Germany diverted perhaps a majority of its divisions. Estimates range into the hundreds, to the east for years. Without that drain, Germany could field far more divisions in the West and North Africa simultaneously. If Germany redeploys even a third of the divisions historically tied to the Eastern Front westward, the immediate effect on the Battle of Britain, the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic Convoy War would be enormous. U-boats supported by more surface escorts and increased air cover could have strangled British imports for longer. A reinforced Africa Corps could have taken Cairo and threatened the Suez Canal earlier. More divisions in France in 1940-41 could have made the prospect of an amphibious invasion of Britain plausible under different naval circumstances. Against this, the United States possessed colossal industrial capacity, shipyards, aircraft factories, and an economy not at risk of occupation. American mobilization was the decisive long-term variable. Axis success in 1941-43 might have been able to delay or complicate U.S. aid to Britain and even deny some strategic sorties. But the U.S. ability to produce carriers, escort vessels, tanks, and aircraft at scale was unmatched. The key question becomes time and geography. Can an axis that includes the USSR sustain a war economy long enough to seize or neutralize British maritime lifelines, control critical raw materials, and force a negotiated peace before U.S. industrial power tips the scales? The answer hinges on resources: oil in the Caucasus, grain from Ukraine, iron or from the Urals, copper and rubber from Japanese conquests. Joint Axis control of Eurasian staples could at least partially insulate Germany and Japan from Allied embargoes. An axis that captures the Caucasus and secures the Persian corridor denies the Allies a key source of Iranian oil and shortens the resource gap. Furthermore, Soviet participation could forestall the catastrophic manpower losses that historically broke German offensive capacity by 1943. Instead, the experience, mobilization, and heavy industries of the USSR, if directed toward Axis aims, would bolster German campaigns in the West while relieving Japan to press in Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. Yet this potential is constrained by politics and by human factors that history often underestimates. First, ideological incompatibility is not merely rhetoric. It runs to the core of governance, justice systems, and mass mobilization. Nazi racial policy required domination and extermination of groups they deemed inferior. Soviet policy had been built on class warfare and mass political terror, creating an administrative architecture to govern millions of people across Eastern Europe and the USSR. in which both partners agree on who is repressed and who is rewarded, is an almost insoluble moral contradiction. Would Nazi racial policy be applied within Soviet territory? Would the Kremlin accept German racial hierarchies that placed Slavs beneath Aryans? A plausible compromise might involve a division of labor. Germany focuses repression in Western and Central Europe and implements its racial policies there, while Soviet authorities retain direct control over Soviet citizens and conduct their own political suppression. But the optics and the ground reality, mass deportations, partisan resistance, and reprisals, would generate instability. Partisans in occupied Europe and within the USSR would not vanish. Indeed, a Soviet government seen as collaborating with Germans would likely fracture its own legitimacy, prompting civil war, splintered partisan movements, and perhaps a prolonged insurgency that would drain resources. Second, command and cohesion matter. Joint staffs with shared objectives reduce friction, but Allied armies routinely suffer from competing priorities. The Germans historically overruled Italian commanders. The Japanese often acted independently of their European partners, and the Soviets had rigid, centralized control through the Politburo and NKVD. Integrating military doctrine, blitzkrieg speed versus Soviet deep operation massing, would require mutual concessions, and crises of ego, Hitler, Stalin, and Japanese generals, could rupture the alliances at sensitive moments. Third, economic integration would be vulnerable to sabotage, corruption, and sabotage by resistance movements. Rail gauges remain a famous practical obstacle. Port capacities, shipping tonnage, and fuel distribution require coordination that is not achieved overnight. Even if an Axis council sets quotas, actual throughput, trains per day carrying fuel and munitions across the Urals, convoys protected from submarine attack, would likely fall short of theoretical maxima. That said, let us assume sufficient administrative fixes, standardization efforts, coordinated convoys, shared industrial plants, are implemented by 1942, with Germany and the USSR establishing joint factories and technology transfer agreements. How does this change the key campaigns? In the Mediterranean, with more divisions and air cover available, Rommel's forces could have cut off British supply lines to Egypt earlier. A quicker Axis victory in North Africa threatens British control of the eastern Mediterranean and the Suez. If Suez falls, Britain's imperial lines to India and the Far East are in jeopardy, and the British ability to project naval power into the Indian Ocean diminishes. Japan, seeing a weakened British grip, might accelerate operations in Burma and India under the protective umbrella of Soviet neutrality or cooperation in Asia. The Indian Ocean becomes more dangerous for Allied convoys, reducing the flow of material to Britain and to China. In Western Europe, a Germany reinforced by manpower freed from the East could concentrate on the air and naval elements needed for a larger invasion or sustained pressure, possibly forcing Britain to sue for terms if transatlantic resupply is sufficiently choked and if the British Isles face sustained bombing combined with blockade-induced shortages. However, the United States remains the wild card. In 1941 to 43, the U.S. Navy and the industrial surge that followed Pearl Harbor overwhelmed Axis, shipbuilding, and logistics. An Axis that includes the USSR removes a key theater of attrition the U.S. relied on, the Eastern Front, but it does not remove U.S. industrial output or the Atlantic convoy system once America commits fully. The decisive strategic variable becomes whether Europe can be neutralized or coerced before American production and the full scale of U.S. mobilization reach peak levels. Another decisive factor is nuclear research and technological competition. In our history, the Manhattan Project was a race whose outcome favored the Allies. An Axis plus USSR would redirect scientific talent and resources across Eurasia. The Soviet scientific establishment included brilliant physicists and technicians, and German nuclear and rocketry programs were advanced in areas. If collaborative, they might accelerate rocketry and nuclear research, but the historical reality is that Nazi Germany decentralized scientific administration and was less efficient at mass projects like Manhattan. The Soviet model, centralized, mobilizing vast human resources, could in theory be an accelerant if ideological and security barriers were lowered. Equally important are colonial empires and revolutions in the periphery. European colonial subjects watched the war's arc and adjusted their calculations. An axis with Soviet participation looks more like a continental Eurasian bloc, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This would change decolonization trajectories. Colonial insurgencies in South and Southeast Asia might either be crushed under an expanded Japanese sphere or, conversely, could find new support from Soviet elements opposed to the Kremlin's collaboration. Unlikely but possible. The moral resonance of the war would also shift. Historically, the Allies framed the fight as a struggle against fascism and genocide. A Soviet alliance with Germany complicates that moral clarity, reduces Allied propaganda potency, and might depress resistance movements whose ideological backbone relied on the promise of liberation by the West and the USSR. The human toll is also important to imagine. Millions who historically died in the East could live through collaboration, but do so under an authoritarian and repressive order that trades ideological purity for survival. At the same time, millions more might die in new campaigns in the West, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean as the redistributed forces press their advantage. The Holocaust and Nazi genocidal policies are a central moral consideration. A Soviet alliance would not erase Nazi anti-Semitism. It may in some geographies magnify vulnerability for Jewish populations previously protected by Soviet rule, and in others lead to more complex patterns of flight and survival. Equally, Soviet purges and deportations of perceived class enemies would continue or worsen under collaboration. A terrible symmetry of mass victimization might result, though the exact modalities would vary by region. Now consider durability in the endgame. History teaches that coalition longevity depends on shared long-term goals and on mechanisms to manage divergence. The axis of Germany, the USSR, and Japan would be an uneasy marriage of convenience that depends on mutual belief that the Anglo-American bloc can be neutralized. If by 1943 to 44 the United States has ramped up production of Liberty ships, aircraft, tanks, and escort carriers, if convoys are increasingly protected and American air power strikes German industrial heartlands, the pressure would again become a test of coercive capacity versus replenishment. The Axis could attempt a negotiated peace with Britain, offering recognition of colonial sovereignty in exchange for blockade relief in a redivided world. But Britain's government and public might refuse to accept a settlement that leaves Nazism and a Soviet-aligned continental bloc intact. If Britain resists, the Atlantic War becomes a long duel of attrition in which U.S. naval and air power gradually overwhelm Axis reach. Alternatively, if the Axis secures a decisive victory early, capturing Suez, splitting the Commonwealth, strangling British commerce, knocking Britain out of the war, and isolating the United States diplomatically, then an uneasy Pax Eurasia might be established. But such a pax would rest on continuous repression, economic autarky, and the inability of the Axis to sustain long supply lines in the face of blockade and partisan sabotage. On the domestic front in the USSR, collaboration would create an internal moral crisis. Communist ideology grounded in class struggle will be compromised by partnership with fascists. Soviet elites would face collective guilt, rationalizations, and eventual factionalization. Over time, this could lead to civil strife, purges, or a reassertion of anti-German sentiment inside the USSR if the costs of alliance, territorial concessions, political subservience become too high. Conversely, a pragmatic Stalinist elite might leverage German technology and markets to consolidate its rule, suppress domestic rivals, and modernize industry faster than in our timeline, though at the cost of moral and political legitimacy. Internationally, the Axis would try to build client states, corporate-style satellite regimes in Eastern Europe, Reichskommissariats, and Soviet client polities that administer local populations while exporting resources to the heartlands. These client states would be unstable, breeding grounds for insurgency and ideological contradiction. The post-war world under such an axis would be different in form. Authoritarian blocs with tight internal controls, truncated trade across ideological lines, and a slower global integration. The United Nations as conceived, a post-war architecture anchored by Allied victory and international law, might never crystallize in its liberal form. Instead, post-war institutions might resemble regional blocs organized around spheres of influence, with the Atlantic and Pacific divided into contested economic zones. The long-term cultural and psychological effects would be profound. Where in our history the Soviet Union projected itself as an anti-fascist liberator, in this variant historical memory becomes muddled. Generations would grow up under a state that collaborated with one of the century's most brutal regimes, complicating national identity and producing deep fractures in historical memory. The moral vocabulary of justice, war crimes tribunals, reparations, and human rights frameworks would be harder to establish globally because victors' morality is foundational to post-war reckoning. Finally, imagine smaller counterfactuals that cascade. A Soviet axis allows Japan to focus on India, bringing an intensified threat to the British Raj and accelerating anti-colonial mobilization. Alternatively, joint German-Soviet access to Iranian and Middle Eastern oil empowers campaigns into North Africa that reshape Arab political development. Or a Soviet unified rail corridor through Eurasia makes possible a truly continental supply pipeline that renders Allied interdiction marginal. Which of these outcomes actually materializes depends on mundane operational details. How quickly rail conversion happens, whether German naval strength could deny Allied convoys, how effectively partisan movements are suppressed, and how the United States responds. The central lesson of this counterfactual is less a deterministic map of conquest than a caution about the fragility of moral clarity in geopolitics. Alliances can be built from incentives, but the sustainability of such alliances depends on institutional capacity, logistics, and the psychological cost of collaboration. An axis including the USSR would enormously increase short-term potency against Britain and could, for a time, tilt strategic balances, yet it would also create an inherently unstable arrangement. Ideological contradictions, centrifugal violence, and administrative inefficiencies that might erode the coalition as rapidly as it was formed. If the United States mobilized to its historical capacity, and if Britain endured long enough to coordinate with American manufacturing and naval power, the Axis coalition would face a slow attrition that could eventually fracture it. If, however, early decisive territorial and maritime victories isolate Britain and slow American intervention, the Axis might force a negotiated settlement that reshapes the world for decades. Both the practicalities of supply and the human dimension, morale, legitimacy, and resistance, would determine which of these futures obtains. Ultimately, the scenario tells us what counterfactuals always tell us. Power without legitimacy is brittle, and alliances erected on expedience are vulnerable to moral and logistical contradictions. A Soviet alignment with the Axis could have enlarged the material capacity of Germany and Japan and altered the timing and geography of major campaigns, but it would have produced a world raw in new ways, richer in strategic possibility and poorer in moral consistency, one in which millions more might survive or perish depending on the contingencies of supply, the stubbornness of the United States industrial response.